Good morning, guys. So today's read aloud is called Tale of a Tadpole. Do you guys know what a tadpole is? Now, it's sort of almost like a caterpillar. You know how a caterpillar gets very hungry, eats a lot, and it goes into a cocoon and it transforms into a beautiful butterfly when it's a grown up? Tadpoles are just like that. Tadpoles are just itty bitty little babies that hatch out of eggs, and then slowly they begin to change and they change into a grown up animal. And I wonder if you know what animal it is. So, we're going to hear this story about a tadpole. And this book is written by Barbara Ann Port and illustrated by Annie Cannon. In this fish tank lived a tadpole named Fred. Every day, Francine feeds him fish food and waits for him to come in waits for his feet to come in. It's what they told her to do at the nature center. So, do you see this teeny tiny little tadpole in the fish tank? He's got a little body. You can see the round body and a long, skinny, wiggly tail. It could take a long time, Francine's mother says. You have to be patient, says Francine's father. I've heard of frogs turned into princes just because some princess kissed them, Francine's older sister tells her. Of course, she means in fairy tales. Have you tried kissing Fred? She asks. Francine ignores her, but every day she watches Fred to see if something happens. Weeks go by. Fred looks a little larger. Do you see? His tail's a little bit bigger. He's got 2 eyes, and his body's looking a little rounder and fatter. Then one day, as Francine is filling up the tank with water from the pond, she sees something. Quick, quick, come look, Francine calls to her family. They come running. Frog legs, Francine's mother says. Back ones, anyway. It's a step in the right direction, says Francine's father. Now, do you see the picture? Look what he's got coming in. What's Fred have growing now next to his tail? Little legs. Funny looking toes for a prince, though, don't you think? Asked Francine's older sister. Francine ignores her, but every day she watches Fred to see if something new has happened. Days go by. Fred's tail looks longer. Then one day, as Francine is adding some stepping stones to the tank, she sees 2 bumps behind Fred's head. At bedtime, Francine looks again. Quick, quick, come look, Francine calls to her family. So you can see how Fred's body's changed a little bit. There's his tail. His back legs are looking a little bit bigger. And instead of being one big circle for a body, we've got these bumps growing out of it. I wonder what they're going to turn into. They come running. They're just in time to see one bump pop out an arm. The next day, Fred has 2. That looks almost like a frog now, Francine's mother says. A froglet, says her father. Or a princelet with a tail, says Francine's older sister. So now you can see he has 1, 2 arms and 1, 2 legs. And he's beginning to turn into a frog. He's still got a long tail, though. I've never seen a frog with a tail. Francine ignores her, but now she gives up feeding Fred. All the nutrients he needs are stored in his tail. Francine knows this from the nature center, but every day she still watches Fred to see what more will happen. Day by day, this does. Fred's arms and legs get fatter. Fred's eyes get bigger. Fred's mouth gets wider. And his tail keeps getting shorter. So can you see how his body's changing a little bit? His eyes are popping out and bigger now. His arms and legs are stronger, and he's got more of a mouth. Look at that. Don't worry, frogs don't need tails, Francine tells him, unworried. Then for the next few days, Francine forgets to wash, and finally she remembers. She rushes to look, but where can Fred be? Francine stares and stares. A tank full of water is all that she sees. And then suddenly, quick, quick, come look, Francine calls to her family. They come running. All of them stare. There, on the top stepping stone, sits a small frog with barely a stub for a tail. He's staring back at them. Well, 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 just look at that, Fred, says Francine's mother. Congratulations, Francine's father says. It's hard to imagine any princess ever wanting to kiss him, though, isn't it? Asks Francine's older sister. Francine ignores her. She hurries off to catch insects to feed Fred. A few days later, Francine's grandparents come for a visit. Francine shows them a frog. His name is Fred, she tells them. Hi there, her grandpa says. He has a bit of a hard time hearing. That Fred certainly is a good-looking toad, says Francine's grandma, who hears fine. Toad? Says Francine. Right, says her grandma. Your Fred is a true toad if ever I saw one. Toad is a kind of land frog. How can you tell? Asks Francine. Pardon me, what did he say? Asks her grandpa, turning up his hearing aid. How do you know Fred's a toad? Francine shouts. No need to shout. I can hear you fine now, her grandpa says, but he's glad to explain. See how dry his skin is and how bumpy? See how short his legs are? If Ted were a frog, his skin would be smoother and wetter. His legs would be longer. His back toes would be webbed more, and he'd be a little bit slimmer. True frogs live in ponds, and true toads live in woods and backyards. Your grandpa and I once had a pet toad in our backyard, says Francine's grandma. It lived there for years. It caught plenty of spiders and insects, believe me. If I were you, I'd put that Ted in the yard and let him catch bugs too, Francine's grandpa says. His name is Fred, says Francine. Still, backyard living sounds good to her. She's getting awfully tired, anyway, of having to catch so many insects to feed him. So the very same day, very carefully, Francine takes Fred from the tank, carries him out to the yard, and sets him on the ground. As she watches, he hops away, but not too far, using his hind legs. He digs a hole in the dirt and backs into it. Fred looks up at Francine and blinks. Then he flicks out his tongue, catches a small fly. Fred pushes in his eyes and swallows it. It's a good pet that doesn't need too much attention, Francine's mother says after dinner that evening. Or shed, says Francine's father. I wonder if kissed toads turn into princes too, says Francine's older sister. Francine ignores her. But Francine's grandma says, oh, I'm sure they do. But you just try and find a princess nowadays who will kiss one. Princess, says Francine's grandpa, his hearing aid turned up. I'd say the story's ended when everyone lives happily ever after. Well then, that's that. All of them do. There's her little toad. And you can see how there's a line of eggs in this picture. And then you see a little tadpole hatched. And then you see a tadpole with legs growing. And then you have a tadpole with legs and arms and a short stumpy tail starting to come out of the water. And then there he is, a big fat toad. So did you know that tadpoles turn into frogs and toads? Both frogs and toads lay their eggs in the water, and then they have little baby tadpoles that squirm out, and they don't look anything like a frog or a toad when they hatch. They live in the water and they swim around, and as they get bigger and bigger, they start to turn into a frog or a toad, just like a caterpillar can turn into a butterfly. They change. So, one difference we might have noticed, though, is that tadpoles don't make a cocoon to change in. They just keep eating and growing, and as they grow their legs and their arms, and their tail gets a little shorter, and their body grows bigger, their eyes grow bigger, and they start to turn into a frog or a toad. But caterpillars build themselves a cocoon, and inside their cocoon, they turn into a butterfly and then come out of the cocoon as a butterfly. So those are a couple differences. Can you think of any other animals that might change, or bugs or anything, that might change in the spring? They might grow and become something different. We call this metamorphosis. Can you think of any other animals? Have you ever seen a tadpole before? Have you ever gotten to see how a tadpole changes into a frog or a toad? Have you ever seen a frog or a toad or caught one? And did you know that they start out as little tadpoles swimming in the water? Pretty cool.